Everyone laughed at the fat virgin mail-order bride until he shouted, "She's mine now. Back off." The train screeches to a halt, dust rising on a cruel little frontier town. A trembling young woman steps onto the platform, suitcase in hand. Laughter explodes, men jeer, women sneer. Her dream of a new life turns to ashes in the space of a heartbeat. But then boots slam on the boardwalk. A scarred rancher, quiet and fierce, bellows words that stop the crowd cold. He claims her as his own, though he never sent for her. Now she must live in his lonely mountain cabin with gossip chasing her every step. Yet what begins as mercy sparks whispers of faith, courage, and even love. But the railroad wants his land, and a forged deed could destroy them both. She holds a secret strength that no one sees until it's too late. Will a mocked bride become the one to save a rancher's legacy and her own heart? Or will the laughter of the town crush them both forever? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The train's piercing whistle echoed through the Colorado mountain air as metal wheels ground against the rails, finally coming to rest at the small depot. Steam billowed around the platform, making the late afternoon sun dance in hazy beams. Abigail Fletcher clutched her worn carpetbag closer, her knuckles white against the leather handle. The moment she'd been both dreading and hoping for had arrived. Taking a deep breath, she stepped down from the train car. Her boots touched solid ground, but her legs felt anything but steady. The platform boards creaked beneath her weight, and immediately she felt the weight of dozens of stares boring into her. The whispers started like a gentle breeze, then grew louder with each passing second. "Would you look at the size of her?" one man muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. A woman in a fine blue dress touched her companion's arm, their shared smirk cutting deeper than any blade. "Reckon that's the mail-order bride," another voice called out, followed by cruel laughter that rippled through the gathered crowd. Ain't no man desperate enough to Abigail's cheeks burned. She tugged her bonnet lower, trying to shield herself from their mockery. The few steps across the platform felt like miles, each one accompanied by another jeer or snicker. Her vision blurred with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. The letter in her pocket, the one that had promised a fresh start, now felt like a foolish dream. Just then, heavy footfalls thundered across the platform. The crowd parted, and through her tears, Abigail saw a tall figure pushing through. Her heart nearly stopped when she got a clear look at him. The man's face bore a long scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, but his eyes, they held something she hadn't expected: dignity and determination. "She's mine, now back off." His voice boomed across the platform, silencing the jeers in an instant. The authority in his tone left no room for argument. The boardwalk fell so quiet that Abigail could hear the telegraph office's key clicking in the distance. She looked up at her defender, trying to make sense of what was happening. This had to be Noah Boone, the man whose advertisement she'd answered. But his fierce protection was more than she dared hope for. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle despite their strength. "Miss Fletcher," he said, his voice softer now, but still carrying enough for the onlookers to hear. "Welcome to Colorado territory." The touch of his hand steadied her trembling fingers. Together they walked past the now silent crowd, their boots echoing on the wooden planks. Abigail kept her head down, but she could feel the mix of surprise and curiosity replacing the earlier mockery in the townsfolk's gazes. Noah guided her along the town's main street, past the general store where the shopkeeper paused in his sweeping to stare, and the millinery where two women whispered behind gloved hands. But under Noah's protective presence, the earlier cruel laughter had died away to respectful distance. "The livery's just ahead," Noah said quietly, his words meant for her ears alone. "I've arranged for Miller's wagon to take us up to the homestead." It's a fair piece out of town. Abigail nodded, still not trusting her voice. The sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. As they approached the livery stable, the smell of hay and leather filled the air, mixing with a coming evening's chill. The liverman, a weathered old fellow, had already hitched a team of horses to a sturdy wagon. He touched the brim of his hat when he saw them approach. "Mr. Boone," he acknowledged, then gave Abigail a courteous nod. "Ma'am." Noah helped her up onto the wagon seat, his movements sure but careful. The wood was worn smooth from years of use, and Abigail settled herself, arranging her skirts as best she could. Her carpetbag, the only piece of her old life she'd brought west, sat between them like a barrier. As Noah took up the reins, lanterns began to flicker to life along the street. Their golden glow cast long shadows across the dirt road, and Abigail caught glimpses of faces in windows and doorways. Some wore expressions of open curiosity, others showed lingering disdain. But a few, particularly among the older folks, seemed to hold a hint of approval at Noah's gallant defense. The horses' hooves clopped steadily as they made their way through town. The air grew sharper with the approach of night, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. Abigail pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, grateful for its warmth. She wanted to thank him for his intervention, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat in silence, her head bowed, stealing occasional glances at the man beside her. His profile was strong despite the scar, and his hands held the reins with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with horses. The town began to fall away behind them, buildings growing sparser as they headed toward the foothills. A coyote's distant cry echoed through the gathering dusk, and somewhere an owl called out its evening greeting. The familiar sounds of civilization, the train whistle, the telegraph's click. The murmur of voices faded into the rhythm of wagon wheels and horse hooves. Noah cleared his throat softly. "It's about an hour's ride to the homestead," he said, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "Might want to wrap that shawl a bit tighter. Gets cold quick once the sun's gone." Abigail nodded, adjusting her wrap. Her fingers brushed against the letter in her pocket, his letter, the one that had brought her here. It had been simple and honest, much like the man himself seemed to be. He'd written of wanting a partner, someone to share in the work and rewards of ranch life. There had been no flowery promises, no fancy words, just plain truth. The wagon rocked steadily onward as the last rays of sunlight painted the clouds in deep purple and gold. Behind them, the town's lanterns twinkled like earthbound stars, growing smaller with each passing minute. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. Despite her lingering embarrassment from the train station, welcome. Abigail felt something else growing in her heart, a cautious hope, born from the moment this scarred rancher had stepped forward to claim her as his own. They continued their journey into the gathering darkness. Two strangers bound together by circumstance and choice, while the Colorado night settled around them like a blanket of stars. The wagon creaked and swayed as they made their way up the mountain road. Moonlight spilled through the towering pines, casting strange shadows across their path. The horses' hooves crunched steadily on the rocky trail, their breath visible in the cold night air. Abigail sat rigid on the hard wooden seat, her mind churning with questions she was afraid to ask. The initial relief of Noah's rescue had faded, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. If he truly had sent for her, why hadn't he said more? Why this heavy silence between them? Finally, gathering her courage, she spoke softly into the darkness. "Mr. Boone, I have your letter here." Her fingers trembled as she reached for her pocket. Noah's hands tightened on the reins. The wagon slowed to a stop, and in the stillness, she heard him draw a deep breath. "Miss Fletcher," he said, his voice rough with regret, "I never wrote no letter." Never placed no advertisement neither. The words hit her like a physical blow. Abigail's throat closed up, and tears sprang to her eyes. Then why, ... double quotes, she whispered, unable to finish. Couldn't stand by and watch them treat you that way, he said simply. Ain't right. Folks being cruel just because they can. Hot tears rolled down Abigail's cheeks as the full weight of her situation crashed over her. My reputation, she choked out. No decent man will offer me lodging now. Everyone saw. They think, ... I know. Noah said quietly. That's why you'll stay with me through winter. The wagon started moving again, following the winding trail. Abigail wiped her tears with shaking hands, trying to make sense of it all. The man beside her was a stranger, kind stranger, perhaps, but a stranger nonetheless. Yet here she was, miles from town, with nowhere else to turn. After a time, they came to a creek that cut across their path, its waters gleaming silver in the moonlight. Noah pulled the wagon to a halt. Need to water the horses, he explained, climbing down. Might as well take a rest ourselves. He helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady and impersonal. While he led the horses to drink, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small bundle. Ain't much, he said, offering her some jerky and a tin cup of coffee from his battered pot. But it'll keep you going till morning. Abigail accepted the simple meal gratefully. The coffee was strong and bitter, the jerky tough, but both helped steady her nerves. They sat on fallen logs near the creek, the sound of running water and drinking horses filling the silence between them. Got a line shack up ahead, Noah said finally. It ain't much, just one room. But it's solid built and warm. You can stay there till spring thaw, if you've a mind to. Why would you do this for me? Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Noah stared into the darkness. Lost my family years back. Know what it's like to have nowhere to turn. He paused, then added, but there's something else you should know. Railroad's been pressing hard for my land. Their men come around regular, trying to force me out. Won't be easy wintering here. I understand, Abigail said softly. Though her heart quaked at the thought of more confrontation, they resumed their journey as the night deepened. Finally, just as dawn began painting the eastern sky, they crested a rise and Abigail saw Noah's home for the first time. The line shack was small but sturdy, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the pale morning air. A split-trail fence enclosed a modest yard, and beyond it, the land rolled away toward distant mountains. Noah helped her down from the wagon one final time. Her legs were stiff from the long journey, and she stumbled slightly. His hand caught her elbow, steadying her, then quickly released it. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting warm light across the plank floor. A narrow cot stood in one corner, a few chairs and a rough-hewn table in another. Iron pots hung from hooks, and dried herbs dangled from the rafters. You take the bedding from the cot, Noah said, moving to stack more wood on the fire. I've got extra quilts in that trunk. You can make yourself comfortable by the hearth. Abigail set to work, grateful for something to do. She arranged the quilts near the fire, making a small bed that was humble but warm. Noah took the bare cot without complaint, turning his back to give her privacy as she settled in as evening approached. Abigail found herself surveying the cabin's stores. There were beans, salt, pork, flour, and coffee, basic provisions, but enough to work with. With Noah's permission, she set about preparing a simple supper. The familiar tasks of cooking helped calm her scattered thoughts. She seasoned the beans carefully, adding a pinch of the dried herbs from above. When the food was ready, she filled 2 tin plates and carried them to the table where Noah sat. He took his first bite and went still. Looking up at her, something softened in his scarred face. Been years since I've eaten a woman's cooking, he said quietly. "Much obliged, Miss Fletcher." Abigail ducked her head, feeling color rise in her cheeks. "Least I could do," she murmured. They ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling beside them and the wind whispering around the cabin's sturdy walls. Outside, the mountain night was settling in, stars beginning to pierce the darkening sky. Inside, two strangers shared a meal, each lost in thoughts of what tomorrow might bring. The morning frost painted delicate patterns across the cabin windows, glowing silver in the early dawn light. Abigail stirred from her quilted bed near the dying embers, the cold mountain air nipping at her nose. She had barely slept, determined to prove herself useful rather than a burden. The floorboards creaked softly under her feet as she moved to stoke the fire. Outside, the steady thunk of an axe splitting wood carried through the crisp air. Noah had been up since before sunrise, preparing for the day's work. Abigail straightened her shoulders, smoothed her apron, and set about making the small cabin more homelike. She began with the dishes from the previous night's supper, scrubbing the iron pots until they gleamed in the growing light. Her hands, soft from city life, protested at the harsh soap and cold water, but she pressed on. Next, she swept the plank floor with careful strokes, gathering dust from corners that had likely gone untouched for months. In the pantry, she found flour and lard enough to make biscuits. The familiar motions of measuring and mixing soothed her nerves. As she worked the dough with steady hands, memories of her mother's kitchen back east rose unbidden. The recipe was one of the few things she had brought with her, carried in her heart rather than her carpet bag. The cabin door opened with a rush of cold air. Noah stamped his boots on the threshold, arms laden with split wood. He stopped short, nostrils flaring at the unexpected smell of baking bread. His eyes moved from the tidied room to Abigail's flour-dusted hands. Something like wonder crossing his weathered face. "Didn't expect," he began, then fell silent as she pulled the first batch of biscuits from the oven. Abigail's eyes widened at the sight of them. Instead of the perfect rounds she'd aimed for, the biscuits had spread and tilted, looking more like misshapen clouds than proper bread. A laugh bubbled up from her chest before she could stop it, bright and genuine. Despite her embarrassment, "Oh dear," she managed between giggles. "They're rather crooked, aren't they?" Noah's mouth twitched. He set down the wood and reached for one of the warm biscuits, steam rising as he broke it open. "Reckon they'll taste just fine," he said, taking a bite. His eyes closed briefly. Better than fine. Over the next several days, Abigail fell into the rhythm of ranch life. She discovered Noah's pile of mending shirts with missing buttons, socks with holes worn through the heels. In the evenings, she sat by the fire with needle and thread, slowly working through the stack while Noah cleaned his tack or whittled by. Lamplight. The physical demands of ranch work tested her resolve daily. The water bucket seemed to grow heavier with each trip to the creek, and her arms trembled as she hauled feed for the horses. More than once, she stumbled on the uneven ground, catching herself before she fell. But each time she pushed herself up and continued. Determined to master these new tasks, Noah watched her efforts without comment. But she caught the quiet approval in his eyes when she finished a particularly difficult chore without complaint. He began showing her small tricks to make the work easier, the best way to balance the water bucket, how to approach the horses so they wouldn't startle. When Sunday morning arrived, Noah surprised her by announcing they would attend church in town. Abigail's stomach knotted at the thought of facing those who had mocked her, but she knew avoiding them would only fuel gossip. She put on her best dress, carefully pressed the night before, and climbed into the wagon with her head held high. The little church's wooden pews were already filling when they arrived. Conversations stuttered to a halt as Noah led Abigail down the aisle, his hand hovering near her elbow. They found seats near the back, where the whispers couldn't reach them so easily. Abigail kept her eyes fixed on her hymnal as the service began. her cheeks burning at the sideways glances from the congregation. But when the first notes of amazing grace filled the small sanctuary, something shifted inside her. The familiar melody called to that private place in her heart where she had always found comfort. Almost without realizing it, she began to sing. Her voice started soft, barely above a whisper, but grew stronger with each verse. Clear and true, it rose above the mumbled singing of those around her, carrying notes of both joy and longing. Noah turned his head slightly, surprised by the pure, sweet sound coming from the woman beside him. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Several heads turned, and the whispers took on a different tone, some still unkind, but others thoughtful and wondering. After the service, most of the congregation hurried past them with averted eyes. A cluster of women huddled near the door, their disapproving mutters carrying clearly, living alone with a man. No proper marriage. Bringing shame, ... But before Abigail could hurry out, elderly widow Morrison stepped forward. Her lined face creased in a gentle smile as she caught Abigail's hand between her own weathered ones. Such a lovely voice. "Dear," she said warmly, "we need more singers in the choir. Perhaps you'll consider joining us." She squeezed Abigail's fingers encouragingly before moving away, leaving behind a small spark of hope. The ride home was quiet, but not uncomfortable. The afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine. When they reached the cabin, Noah unhitched the horses while Abigail started supper. Later, as darkness settled over the valley, Abigail knelt beside her quilted bed. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls as she bowed her head in prayer. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her voice barely stirring the night air. "For this shelter, for work to do, for small kindnesses." She paused, throat tight with emotion. "And thank you for giving me strength when I thought I had none left." From his cot in the corner, Noah listened to her soft words, his own prayer echoing silently in his heart. The days grew shorter as December settled over the Colorado mountains. Snow draped the pines in white, and frost etched delicate patterns on the cabin windows each morning. For Abigail, the rhythm of ranch life became familiar, though challenges remained. Each dawn brought new lessons, and none proved more important than learning to handle the horses. Noah led her to the corral one crisp morning, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Horses can sense fear," he explained, demonstrating how to hold the reins. "You need to be firm, but gentle like this." His scarred hands moved with surprising grace. Showing her the proper tension, Abigail wrapped the leather straps around her fingers as he had shown, trying to mirror his movements. The horse, a gentle bay mare, shifted nervously under her inexperienced touch. "That's too tight," Noah said softly. "Think of it like holding a bird. You need enough grip to keep it safe, but not so much you hurt it." Abigail loosened her hold slightly, and the mare settled. A small smile tugged at her lips as she felt the connection between her hands and the horse's mouth grow more natural. "Like this." Noah nodded, and something in his eyes softened as he watched her progress. "You're learning quick." Over the next few days, Abigail practiced whenever she could. Sometimes she fumbled, and once she nearly dropped the reins altogether when the mare shied at a rabbit darting across their path. Instead of shrinking from the mistake, she laughed at herself, her voice carrying across the snow-covered yard. "Well, I reckon that wasn't quite right," she said, patting the mare's neck to calm them both. Noah, splitting wood nearby, looked up at the sound of her laughter. A smile crossed his weathered face before he could catch at something that seemed to happen more often lately. One morning, when the sun had barely crested the mountains, Noah suggested they check the rabbit snares near the tree line. Abigail bundled up in her warmest shawl, grateful for the thick woolen garment as they crunched through the crusty snow. They were examining the first trap when a figure emerged from the trees. Abigail startled slightly, but Noah's calm demeanor told her there was no danger. The man approaching them moved with fluid grace despite the deep snow, his features marking him as Native American. "Henry," Noah called in greeting, stepping forward to clasp the man's hand. "Didn't expect to see you up this high." Henry White Elk's dark eyes crinkled at the corners as he returned the handshake. "The rabbits run thick here when snow comes." His gaze shifted to Abigail, and she was struck by the quiet dignity in his bearing. Noah made the introductions. "Henry White Elk. This here's Abigail Fletcher. She's staying through the winter." Henry inclined his head respectfully. "Welcome to the high country, Miss Fletcher." His English was clear and precise. With no trace of the exaggerated accent Abigail had heard some townspeople mock. "Thank you, Mr. White Elk," she replied. Touched by his courteous manner, Henry reached into his pack and withdrew a carefully crafted snare. "The rabbits are clever this year. This design works better than the old wire loops." He demonstrated the mechanism, showing how it could catch game without causing undue suffering. Abigail listened intently, asking questions about the best places to set the traps and how to preserve meat through the winter months. Henry answered each query with patience, sharing knowledge passed down through generations of his people. "The land provides," he explained, "but we must take only what we need and waste nothing." He offered her the snare. "Here, you will make good use of this." "I couldn't possibly," Abigail began. But Henry shook his head. "Consider it a welcome gift," he said firmly. "There will be more snow before spring." Good traps mean full bellies. The morning's hunting proved successful. Between their existing snares and Henry's new design, they collected several plump rabbits. Henry showed Abigail how to field dress them quickly and cleanly, his skilled hands guiding her through the process. When they returned to the cabin, Abigail insisted Henry stay for a meal. "Please," he said, "let me cook something proper with what you've helped us catch." Henry glanced at Noah, who nodded. "Reckon we could all use a hot meal." Abigail set to work, determined to make something special. She combined the fresh rabbit meat with vegetables from the root cellar, adding herbs she'd dried in the fall. The stew pot bubbled cheerfully over the fire, filling the cabin with savory aromas. As evening drew in, the three gathered around Noah's rough-hewn table. Lamplight cast a warm glow over their faces as Abigail served thick bowls of stew, with the last of yesterday's cornbread. The meal was unlike any Abigail had shared before. Henry spoke of his people's traditions of reading weather in cloud patterns and finding medicine in common plants. Noah added tales of their shared adventures tracking lost cattle through spring floods. Avoiding grizzlies in the high passes, Abigail found herself drawn into their easy friendship. Here was none of the cruel laughter she'd known in town, none of the sideways glances or whispered judgments. Instead, she discovered the simple pleasure of being treated as a person of worth. After the dishes were cleared and Henry had departed with promises to return, Abigail sat by the fire with her journal. The blank pages had been her confidant since leaving home. And tonight she had much to record. "I never thought to find friendship in these mountains," she wrote, the pencil scratching softly against paper. "Yet today I was taught by a man of great wisdom who treated me with more respect than any fine society gentleman ever has." And Noah, ... Single quotes. She paused, glancing across the cabin where he sat mending harness by lamplight. "Noah sees me truly, sees me not as someone to mock or pity, but as a person who might have value." Noah looked up then, catching her smile in the firelight. Something shifted in his expression, softening around his eyes, a thoughtful set to his mouth. The scarred hand holding his work needle stilled for a moment as he considered the woman across from him. This was not the same frightened creature who had stepped off the train weeks ago. She held herself differently now, with a quiet confidence born of small victories and growing skill. Her laugh came more freely, Her eyes sparkled with determination rather than tears as he watched her bend back to her writing. Noah found himself wondering if there was more to her arrival than simple chance. He had acted from pity that day at the station, unable to stomach the town's cruelty. But now, seeing how she brought warmth to his cold cabin and friendship to his solitary life, he began to think, perhaps, Providence had guided her here for reasons he was only beginning to understand. The morning arrived silent and white, with snow falling in thick curtains that obscured the mountains. Abigail woke to find the cabin's windows frosted over, the world beyond transformed into a blank canvas. She stoked the dying embers and added fresh logs, watching the flames catch and grow before turning to her morning tasks. Bundled in 3 shawls, she stepped out into the crystalline air. Her boots crunched through fresh powder as she made her way to the creek, 2 wooden buckets swinging from her shoulders. The familiar path looked different under its pristine covering, but she had walked it enough times now to find her way. From his place by the woodpile, Noy paused in his work to watch her progress. Snow dusted Abigail's shoulders and caught in her hair, but she moved with steady purpose. The creek's usual music was muffled by ice, yet she broke through the thin crust at the edges without hesitation, dipping each bucket in turn. The weight of the filled containers made the return journey harder. Snow slipped inside her boots, and her fingers ached from cold despite her mittens. Still, Abigail pressed on without complaint, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She had promised herself she would pull her own weight here, and a little snow wouldn't change that. Noah's axe rang out, splitting another log. His movements were efficient, practiced, each stroke precise, despite the weather. Yet his gaze kept returning to Abigail as she made trip after trip, watching how she adjusted her technique to maintain balance on the slippery ground by late afternoon. The snow showed no signs of letting up. They retreated inside, where Abigail had kept the fire well fed. She hung their wet outer garments near the hearth and set about preparing their evening meal while Noah arranged the newly split logs. As she stirred the pot of beans, Abigail gathered her courage. "I was thinking," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Perhaps we might read together tonight. From Scripture." Noah's hands stilled on the logs. He hadn't opened his mother's Bible since the fever took his family 5 years ago. It sat on a high shelf, gathering dust alongside other memories he tried not to disturb. Seeing his hesitation, Abigail added gently, "Just a few verses, maybe from Psalms. My ma always said they were like balm for troubled times." Something in her tone reached past Noah's defenses. He nodded slowly, then stood to retrieve the leather-bound book. Dust fell from its cover as he brought it to the table, after they had eaten. Abigail cleaned their tin plates while Noah remained seated, one scarred hand resting on the Bible's worn cover. When she finished, she pulled her chair closer to the lamplight and opened to the Book of Psalms. Her voice filled the cabin, steady and clear. "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear. Though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea." Noah's hands trembled slightly as the familiar words washed over him. They stirred memories of Sunday mornings long past his mother's voice leading family prayers, his father's deep amen, the peace that had filled their home before illness struck. Abigail noticed his distress. Without interrupting her reading, she reached across the table and placed her hand gently on his arm. The simple touch anchored him, drawing him back from painful memories to this moment, the warm cabin, the lamp's soft glow. Abigail's voice carrying ancient promises of comfort. That night marked the beginning of a new routine. Each evening after supper, they would read together. Sometimes Noah would take a turn, his deep voice growing more confident as days passed. Other times, he simply listened as Abigail shared verses that had carried her through her own dark times. The storm raged for 3 days before finally breaking. On the morning of the fourth day, they emerged to find the world transformed. Sunlight sparkled off unblemished snow, and the air held that peculiar clarity that comes only after a heavy storm. "Let me show you something," Noah said, after they had tended to the morning chores. He led Abigail to the barn, where he saddled to horses her usual mare and his sturdy gelding. They rode out across the glittering landscape, their horses picking careful paths through the deep snow. Noah pointed out landmarks as they went to lightning-struck pine that marked his eastern boundary, a distinctive rock formation to the south, the creek that provided water for his cattle in summer. "All this," he explained, gesturing to the valley spread before them, "has been worked by honest hands for 3 generations. My grandfather cleared this land. My father improved it. I mean to keep it that way." Abigail listened intently as Noah described how the railroad had been pressuring ranchers up and down the valley to sell. "They want to put the main line through here," he said, his jaw tightening. "Say they'll take the land by force if they have to." "They can't just take it," Abigail protested. "You have rights. Law's not always clear out here," Noah replied grimly. "Railroad has money. Lawyers. They've bought off plenty of local officials in other places." Abigail straightened in her saddle, chin lifting with determination. "Well, they'll have to face both of us then. I may not look like much, but I can be stubborn when need be." Noah turned to her, surprised by the fierce loyalty in her voice. Their eyes met across the space between their horses, and something unspoken passed between them. Here was no fragile creature needing protection, but a partner willing to stand beside him in trouble. The moment stretched, filled with things neither quite dared to voice. Finally, Noah cleared his throat. "We should head back." Getting near supper time that evening, they sat across from each other at the rough-hewn table, sharing a meal of venison stew and cornbread. The single candle between them cast warm light across their faces, softening edges and shadows. Neither spoke much, but the silence felt comfortable, even tender. Abigail noticed how the candlelight caught the silver threading through Noah's dark hair, how his scarred hands moved with surprising gentleness as he broke his bread. Noah found his gaze drawn to the way Abigail's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled, how she hummed almost imperceptibly while serving their food. The quiet stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and growing understanding. Outside, snow began falling again, but inside the cabin, warmth bloomed that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. Through the window, the last light of day painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of purple and gold. Another evening approached, promising more shared verses and quiet companionship. Neither Abigail nor Noah could have said exactly when their arrangement of convenience had begun transforming into something deeper. But both felt the change as surely as they felt the winter wind that whistled past their snug cabin walls. The message arrived with the morning frost. A rider, his horse lathered from hard travel, reined up at Noah's gate. His news brought a chill deeper than the winter air. The railroad men had called for a town council meeting. They meant to settle land claims once and for all. Noah's jaw tightened as he read the hastily scrawled note. Through the cabin window, he could see Abigail at her morning tasks, humming as she worked. Her presence these past weeks had brought light to his solitary life. Now that light was threatened by men who valued profit over people. "Abigail," he called, stepping back inside. She turned from the stove, flour dusting her apron. "There's to be a council meeting tomorrow. The railroad means to press their claim." She wiped her hands, concern crossing her face. "You'll go." "Have to." "Would you, .. double quotes, he hesitated, then pressed on. "Would you come with me?" "Might need someone level-headed there." Abigail's cheeks colored slightly, but she nodded. "Of course. Though I don't know what help I'll be." The next morning dawned clear and cold. They set out early, the wagon wheels creaking over frozen ruts. Abigail sat straight-backed beside Noah, her best bonnet secured against the wind. Neither spoke much during the journey, but their shared silence held its own comfort. The town hall was already crowded when they arrived. Farmers and ranchers filled the wooden benches, their wives clustered together, whispering. The railroad foreman stood near the front, his suit marking him as different from the work-worn crowd. His lips curled in a slight smirk as Noah and Abigail entered. They found seats near the back. Abigail felt the familiar sting of stares and whispers, but she kept her chin up. Noah's solid presence beside her helped steady her nerves. The meeting began with the usual formalities. The mayor, a thin man with nervous hands, called for order. The railroad foreman stepped forward, his boots clicking on the wooden floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "The Western Pacific Railroad brings progress to these mountains. We offer fair compensation for necessary land acquisitions." He paused, his gaze settling on Noah, though some seemed resistant to progress. From his briefcase, he withdrew a document. "I hold here a deed, properly filed and witnessed, to the land currently occupied by Mr. Boone. This deed predates his family's claim." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Noah half rose, but Abigail touched his arm. "Let me see it," she whispered. The foreman passed the deed around. When it reached them, Abigail studied it carefully. Her father had taught her to read contracts thoroughly, a lesson learned after losing their farm back. East to clever wording. Something caught her eye. The ink showed subtle differences in certain places. The dates seemed particularly suspect, with slightly darker numbers that didn't quite match the rest of the text. She leaned close to Noah's ear. "This isn't right," she whispered. "Look at the ink. It's been altered. And the paper's too new for the date it claims." The foreman's sharp eyes noticed their conference. "Perhaps the lady has something to share." His voice dripped with mock courtesy. "Though I suspect her expertise lies more in consuming provisions than examining legal documents." Laughter erupted through the hall. Abigail's face burned as the cruel sound washed over her. She had heard such mockery before, but it never hurt less. "I reckon that's why Boone took her in," someone called from the crowd. "Felt sorry for her. Probably eats him out of house and home." Noah's hands clenched into fists. His face darkened with rage as he started to rise. The foreman's smirk widened, clearly hoping to provoke violence that would discredit Noah's claim. But Abigail's gentle touch on his arm stopped him. "Not like this," she whispered, though her voice shook with unshed tears. "Don't let them win this way." The muscles in Noah's jaw worked as he struggled with his anger. Finally, he nodded stiffly. Abigail gathered her shawl, and they walked out together, heads high despite the continued laughter behind them. The ride home seemed longer than the morning's journey. Abigail sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, fighting back tears. Noah drove with tight-lipped fury, his knuckles white on the reins. Back at the cabin, Abigail moved mechanically through her evening tasks. The humiliation of the meeting weighed heavily on her spirit. As she prepared their supper, she felt the familiar darkness of worthlessness threatening to overwhelm her. But then she remembered her mother's words. "When trouble comes, girl, take it to the Lord first." Setting down her spoon, Abigail sank to her knees beside the rough wooden table. "Dear Father," she began softly, her voice trembling. "I don't understand your purpose here, but I trust you. Give us strength to face this trial with dignity. Help us fight with truth, not fists. And Lord, double quotes," she paused, wiping her eyes. "Help me remember that your love doesn't depend on what others see when they look at me." Noah stood in the doorway, listening. Shame filled him as he remembered his near violence at the meeting. Abigail's quiet prayer spoke of a different kind of strength, one he desperately needed. "I'm sorry," he said quietly when she finished. You were right to stop me. I nearly gave them exactly what they wanted. Abigail rose, brushing dust from her skirt. We'll fight them, Noah, but we'll do it with honor. That deed is false, he said, moving to add wood to the fire, but proving it won't be easy. Then we'll pray for wisdom, Abigail replied simply. And we'll keep looking for the truth. They sat together by the fire that evening, not speaking much. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as they each contemplated the day's events. Though the air still held the sting of humiliation, something stronger was growing between them, a shared purpose, a solemn commitment to stand together against injustice. Noah watched Abigail as she mended one of his shirts by firelight. Her hands moved steadily despite the day's upset, just as her faith held steady despite mockery. He was beginning to understand that her kind of strength, quiet, enduring, rooted in something deeper than pride, might be exactly what he needed in his fight against the railroad. The fire crackled and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, wind whispered through pine branches, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. But inside the cabin, the silence between them was filled with unspoken understanding and growing resolve. Morning sunlight crept through the cabin windows, touching the rough-hewn table where breakfast dishes sat untouched. The previous day's confrontation at the town meeting hung heavy in the air, like storm clouds refusing to break. Abigail stood at the wash basin, mechanically scrubbing plates that were already clean, her mind replaying the foreman's cruel words. Noah watched her from the doorway, his own heart heavy with the weight of their situation. "You don't have to work so hard today," he said softly. "After yesterday, ... double quotes." Abigail straightened her shoulders, though her hands trembled slightly. "Work helps me think clear," she replied, reaching for the flour bin. "And we need fresh bread." He recognized the quiet determination in her voice and nodded, heading out to tend the horses. Through the window, Abigail watched him walk toward the barn, his steps slower than usual, burdened by worry. The familiar rhythm of kneading dough helped settle her spirit. She hummed softly as she worked an old hymn her mother used to sing when troubles came. Outside, she could hear the chickens scratching in their yard, waiting for their morning feed. By afternoon, the cabin filled with the wholesome scent of baking bread. Abigail had just scattered corn for the chickens when she spotted a rider approaching. The sun was already slanting toward evening, painting long shadows across the snow-dusted yard. "Henry," Noah called out in greeting, emerging from the barn. "Didn't expect you today." Henry White Elk dismounted smoothly, his expression serious. "Friend, I bring news about that deed." He glanced at Abigail as she approached, acknowledging her with a respectful nod. "May we speak inside?" Around the kitchen table, Henry shared his suspicions. "The paper is wrong," he said, his calm voice carrying the weight of certainty. "I have seen many deeds in my work with the agent's office. This one feels new, though it claims to be old." "Just as I thought," Abigail said, pouring coffee into tin cups. The ink looked different in places. Henry's dark eyes showed approval. "You have a good eye, Miss Fletcher. I believe we can find proof in the county records." He turned to Noah. "The original filings would show the truth." The clerk's office. Noah frowned. "They might not let us search freely." "I can help," Abigail said quickly, then faltered as both men looked at her. "I used to help Father with contracts. I know how to read such things carefully." Noah's immediate impulse was to protect her from another public confrontation. But something in Abigail's steady gaze made him pause. She had already shown more courage than many men he knew. "We should go tomorrow," Henry suggested. Early, before the railroad men arrived for their business. After Henry left, Noah found Abigail at the stove, stirring beans for supper. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Face those people again." She turned to face him, wooden spoon still in hand. "Yes, I do. The Lord doesn't give us burdens without also giving us strength to bear them." Her voice grew stronger. "And I want to help." The next morning dawned bitter cold. Abigail wrapped herself in her heaviest cloak, tucking a shawl around her neck for extra warmth. Noah helped her into the wagon, his hands lingering briefly on her arm as if to give her strength. Henry met them at the edge of town, his horse's breath steaming in the cold air. The streets were still quiet as they made their way to the courthouse, though a few early risers paused to stare at the unlikely trio. "I'll wait here," Noah said when they reached the clerk's office, his voice tight. "Keep watch for railroad men." Inside, Abigail found herself in a small room lined with leather-bound record books. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, seemed surprised by their request, but didn't object when Henry explained they needed to verify property records. Hours passed as Abigail and Henry carefully examined page after page of land filings. The work was tedious, but Abigail refused to rush. Her fingers traced each line of spidery handwriting, comparing dates and descriptions. Near midday, her heart suddenly leaped. "Henry," she whispered, pointing to an entry. "Look here." The original filing showed clearly Noah's name, the correct property boundaries, and a date that proved his claim predated any railroad interest. Henry studied it carefully, then nodded with satisfaction. "This is what we needed," he said, his usual reserve giving way to a slight smile. "The foreman's deed cannot stand against this truth." Abigail pressed her hands to her mouth, fighting back tears of relief. Her fingers trembled as she copied down the relevant details in her neat handwriting. The sun was already dropping toward the mountains when they finally started home. Noah drove faster than usual, wanting to reach the cabin before full dark. Beside him, Abigail held the precious notes close, her heart lighter than it had been in days. Back at the cabin, the three of them gathered around the table while Henry explained the significance of their discovery. "The railroad cannot claim land that was legally granted to another," he said firmly. "Their deed is worthless." "Thanks to your sharp eyes," Noah said softly, looking at Abigail. The pride in his voice made her cheeks warm. After Henry departed, Abigail busied herself preparing their evening meal. She warmed the leftover beans and baked fresh cornbread, the simple tasks grounding her after the emotional day. They ate mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet filled with shared relief and unspoken gratitude. Noah took much longer than usual with his portion, stretching out each bite as if reluctant to end the meal. Abigail felt his eyes on her as she cleared the table, her hands moving slowly through the familiar motions of washing dishes. Her heart fluttered at his lingering presence, though she kept her gaze on her work. The cabin felt different somehow, warmer, more like home. As she dried the last plate, Abigail allowed herself to hope that perhaps she had found not just shelter here, but a place where she truly belonged. The Sabbath dawned clear and cold, sunlight gleaming off fresh snow. Abigail stood before the cabin's small mirror, adjusting her bonnet with trembling fingers. Last night's discovery of the true deed had given her courage, but the thought of facing the town again made her stomach twist. "We don't have to go," Noah said from the doorway, noting her nervous movements. He had already hitched the wagon, but doubt clouded his features. Abigail smoothed her best dress, the dark blue wool showing signs of wear. "The Lord gives us strength through fellowship," she said softly. "And I made grandmother's beef stew." She gestured to the covered pot, cooling near the hearth. Noah's expression softened. He had tasted her cooking these past weeks and knew its worth. "Reckon you're right about fellowship," he admitted. "Though some folks don't deserve your kindness." The wagon wheels creaked through fresh snow as they made their way to town. Abigail held the warm pot in her lap, wrapped in quilts to keep it hot. Her breath frosted in the morning air as she whispered prayers for courage. The church stood proud against the mountain backdrop, its white-painted boards gleaming. Smoke curled from the cook stove chimney where the ladies were preparing for the supper. As Noah helped Abigail down from the wagon, she could feel eyes watching from the church steps. Conversation died as they entered the fellowship hall. Abigail clutched her pot tighter, face burning as whispers rippled through the crowd. Noah's hand found the small of her back, steadying her as they made their way to the long tables. "Welcome," the pastor's wife said kindly, though her smile seemed strained. "You can set that right here with the other dishes." Abigail carefully placed her stew among the cornbread and chicken dishes. She noticed several women draw their contributions slightly away from hers, as if her food might somehow taint theirs. Noah saw too, his jaw tightening. The service began with the usual prayers and scripture readings. Abigail sat straight-backed beside Noah, though she felt the stares boring into her. When the pastor called for the first hymn, she gripped her hymnal with white knuckles. "Amazing Grace," the pastor announced. All together now. The opening notes from the piano filled the church. Abigail closed her eyes, drew a deep breath, and began to sing. Her voice rose clear and pure above the congregation, carrying the beloved words with heartfelt emotion. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." ... The other voices gradually faltered as heads turned toward her. Abigail kept her eyes on her hymnal, but her voice grew stronger, soaring to the rafters with angelic clarity. Each note carried years of faith and longing, of prayers whispered in lonely rooms. Noah watched in wonder as her song filled the church. He had heard her quiet hymns at the cabin, but this was different. This was the voice of someone claiming their place before God and man alike. When the final note faded, silence held for several heartbeats. Abigail opened her eyes to find the entire congregation staring. Some faces showed genuine awe, others confusion, as if they couldn't reconcile such beauty coming from someone they had mocked. The pastor cleared his throat, clearly moved. "Truly, the Lord gifts his children in mysterious ways," he said. "Now, let us pray." During the meal that followed, several people approached their table. The banker's wife praised Abigail's voice with seeming sincerity. An elderly deacon asked if she might consider joining the choir. Even some who had whispered unkindly before now offered hesitant compliments. "Your stew is real tasty." Miss Fletcher, the blacksmith's daughter, said shyly, coming back for seconds. "Would you share the recipe?" Abigail's cheeks flushed with pleasure as she explained about browning the meat just so. Noah watched her bloom under the simple kindness, his heart swelling with pride. But not everyone was won over. From a corner table, the railroad foreman's harsh laugh cut through the pleasant murmur of conversation. "Guess even a cow can make pretty sounds," he sneered, just loud enough to carry. "Though I wouldn't trust the bench to hold up under the strain." Several of his cronies chuckled. Noah's hands clenched into fists, his face darkening. But before he could rise, Abigail's fingers touched his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "He's not worth breaking your word to the Lord." Noah forced his hands to relax, though anger still burned in his chest. He watched in admiration as Abigail lifted her chin and continued talking with the blacksmith's daughter as if she hadn't heard the cruel words. The ride home was quiet, broken only by the steady clip of hooves and the occasional cry of a night bird. Snow had begun falling again, soft flakes drifting in the wagon's lantern light. Abigail sat close to Noah for warmth, her empty pot nestled in her lap, inside the cabin. While Noah banked the fire, he heard a muffled sob. Turning, he found Abigail seated at the table, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, wiping her eyes with her shawl. "I don't mean to be foolish. It's just ... She drew a shaky breath. "When I was singing, I felt the Lord's presence so strong. Like he was telling me I belong here." Despite what some might say, Noah pulled his chair closer, taking her work-roughened hands in his. "You do belong," he said firmly. Your voice moved the whole town today, even those too stubborn to admit it. You really think so? She looked up at him, hope shining through her tears. I know so. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. You showed more courage than anyone in that church. Facing them down with grace and song, fresh snowflakes drifted past the window, but neither noticed. The cabin glowed with warmth from the fire, and something deeper, a growing understanding between two hearts that had found unexpected shelter in each other. Abigail's tears gradually ceased. She hummed softly as she moved about the cabin, preparing for bed. The hymn's melody lingered in the air like a blessing, making the small space feel more like home than ever before. Noah watched her from his place by the fire, seeing not the woman the town had mocked, but someone of rare strength and beauty, someone who could face cruelty with dignity and transform pain into praise, someone who made his solitary life feel suddenly rich with possibility. The snow continued falling outside, covering the world in pristine white, while inside the cabin, two hearts drew closer in the quiet aftermath of a day that had changed everything. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of steel gray. Inside the cabin, frost traced delicate patterns on the window panes as the temperature plummeted. Abigail stirred beneath her quilts, the bitter cold nipping at her nose. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only faintly glowing embers. Without hesitation, she rose from her makeshift bed near the hearth, wrapping a shawl tightly around her shoulders. The floorboards creaked softly beneath her feet as she made her way to the woodbox. She carefully placed several logs on the dying embers, coaxing them back to life with gentle breaths and kindling until flames flickered anew. Noah's quiet breathing from his cot in the corner told her he still slept. She moved quietly, not wanting to wake him too early. The familiar routine of morning chores brought comfort as she worked. She filled the cast-iron pot with water and oats, hanging it over the growing fire for porridge. The cabin gradually warmed as she worked. Humming softly, she measured coffee into the battered pot, the rich aroma filling the small space. The tune was one of the hymns from yesterday's service, and it flowed naturally from her lips as she moved about the kitchen area. Noah woke to the gentle sound of her voice and the welcoming smells of breakfast. He lay still for a moment, taking in the peaceful scene. Abigail's humming floated through the cabin like a morning prayer. It had been so long since these walls had known such gentle sounds. "Morning," he said finally, sitting up. "You're up early." Abigail turned from the stove, a warm smile lighting her face. "The cold woke me. I thought you might appreciate hot coffee before heading out." "Much obliged." He pulled on his boots, watching as she ladled steaming porridge into 2 bowls. She had added dried apples and a sprinkle of precious cinnamon, making the simple meal feel special. They ate in comfortable silence, sharing the morning's first moments. Noah couldn't help noticing how different breakfast felt now compared to his solitary meals before she came. Even the worn table seemed more welcoming with her sitting across from it. "I'll be hauling lumber today," he said as he finished his coffee. "That last storm brought down some good trees up near the creek." Abigail nodded, gathering their empty bowls. "Take care on those icy slopes. I'll have supper waiting when you return." Noah pulled on his heavy coat and gloves, then stepped out to saddle his horse. The morning air bit sharply through his layers, promising a brutal day of work ahead. As he led his mount to the cabin for his lunch pail, Abigail's humming drifted through the door again. He paused, the sound striking something deep in his chest. How long had it been since these walls had known a woman's song? Since anyone had cared enough to make his house feel like more than just shelter? The ride to the fallen timber was long and cold, giving Noah plenty of time to reflect. With each hoofbeat, his thoughts returned to the cabin, to Abigail's quiet strength and gentle ways, to how she faced down the town's cruelty with dignity. to the way her presence had transformed his sparse dwelling into something warmer, more alive. Back at the cabin, Abigail kept busy throughout the day. She swept the rough wooden floors and scrubbed the few dishes they owned until they gleamed. In a corner cupboard, she found some forgotten fabric, simple cotton, but clean and sturdy, with careful measurements and steady stitches. She fashioned curtains for the cabin's 2 small windows. The fabric was plain, but she added a simple decorative stitch along the edges, humming as she worked. When hung, the curtains softened the harsh winter light and made the cabin feel more finished. As afternoon shadows lengthened, she began preparing supper. She mixed bread dough, kneading it thoroughly before setting it to rise near the fire. A pot of beans simmered slowly with a ham bone, filling the cabin with savory aromas. The sun was setting when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Noah appeared in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders and exhaustion clear in his movements. His face brightened at the sight of the warm cabin and waiting meal. "Let me tend to those wet things," Abigail insisted, helping him out of his snow-covered coat. "Sit by the fire and warm yourself." Noah sank gratefully into his chair while Abigail hung his coat to dry. She poured him coffee and checked the bread baking in the Dutch oven. Her nose wrinkled as she lifted the lid. "Oh dear," she said, pulling out a slightly blackened loaf. "I'm afraid I got distracted with the curtains." Noah couldn't help chuckling at her dismayed expression. "Reckon it'll taste fine just the same." His laughter was infectious, and soon Abigail joined in. "Well, at least the beans aren't burned," she said, still giggling as she served their plates. Noah took a bite of the dark bread, grinning. "Been so long since I laughed like this," he admitted softly. "Not since I was a boy, I expect." Abigail's heart warmed at his words. After they finished eating, she cleared the dishes while Noah fetched the Bible from its shelf. It had become their evening ritual, this shared reading of Scripture, and Abigail looked forward to it each night. She settled into her chair as Noah opened to the book of Psalms. Instead of reading himself, he handed her the worn volume. "Would you?" "Your voice brings the words to life somehow." Abigail took the Bible carefully, touched by his request. Her clear voice filled the cabin as she read about God's faithful love and tender mercies. Noah listened intently, his weary face relaxing as the familiar words washed over him. When she finished reading, neither moved to break the peaceful silence that followed. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Through the new curtains, stars twinkled in the clear mountain sky. Noah finally stirred, reluctant to end the evening, but knowing they both needed rest. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For the reading? For making this place... .. Double quotes, he gestured around the cabin, searching for words. "Feel like home," Abigail supplied softly. He nodded, their eyes meeting in the firelight. "Exactly that." "Good night, Noah," she whispered, a blush warming her cheeks as she turned toward her bed of quilts. "Good night, Abigail." As she lay in her bed that night, Abigail's heart felt full to bursting. The cruel words she had endured throughout her life, unwanted, unmarriageable, unlovable, seemed to fade like morning mist. Here in this humble cabin, she had found something she had always longed for, but never dared hope to find. She had found belonging. The fire burned low as sleep crept over the cabin. Outside, the bitter cold held the mountain in its grip, but inside, warmth bloomed like a flower turning toward the sun. For the first time, Abigail allowed herself to dream of a future here, not as an unwelcome guest or temporary burden, but as someone truly wanted, truly home. The mountain dawn crept over the horizon, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Inside the cabin, Abigail's hands trembled as she threaded her needle. Noah's best coat lay across her lap, its loose button a testament to years of wear. "Hold still now," she murmured, positioning the button carefully. Noah stood patiently as she worked, his jaw tight with tension. The hearing before the judge loomed ahead of them like a storm cloud on the horizon. "There," Abigail said, securing the final stitch. "That should hold firm." Her fingers lingered on the rough wool, and she bowed her head slightly. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "guide us today. Let truth prevail." Noah's hand found her shoulder, squeezing gently. "Your prayers mean more than you know." They set out as the sun cleared the mountains, their wagon wheels crunching through fresh snow. The cold bit through Abigail's shawls, but her mind was too full of worry to notice. She rehearsed the details of the county records in her mind, determined not to forget a single date or entry. The courthouse stood tall against the morning sky, its wooden steps already crowded with townspeople. News of the hearing had spread like wildfire, drawing curious onlookers eager for entertainment. Abigail felt their stares as Noah helped her down from the wagon. "Well, well," came a mocking voice. "If it ain't the rancher and his oversized bride." The railroad foreman emerged from the crowd, his expensive coat marking him apart from the local folk. Several men laughed at his words, but others looked away, uncomfortable. Noah's shoulders stiffened, but he kept his voice steady. "Move aside, sir. We've business with the judge." Inside, the courthouse buzzed with whispered conversations. Wooden benches creaked as people shifted to get a better view. Henry White Elk sat quietly near the front, nodding slightly as Noah and Abigail passed. His presence gave Abigail courage. The judge, a graying man with sharp eyes, called the hearing to order. His gavel crack scattered the murmurs like startled birds. "This court will hear the matter of the railroad's claim against Mr. Noah Boone's property," he announced. "Mr. Foreman, present your case." The foreman strode forward, producing his deed with a flourish. "Your Honor, I hold here a legal document proving the railroad's right to that land." He turned to face the crowd. "Poor Boone here, he's been misled, probably distracted by taking in strays." His eyes fixed on Abigail with cruel amusement. More laughter rippled through the room. Abigail felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her eyes forward, remembering Noah's faith in her. The foreman continued, his voice growing louder. "This deed, signed and witnessed proper, shows clear as day that the railroad has rights to that parcel. Boone's fighting against progress itself, Your Honor, and for what? A patch of scrub and rock, and a woman no other man would claim." Noah's hand clenched into a fist, but Abigail touched his arm gently. The judge frowned, studying the presented deed. "The document appears to be in order," he said slowly. "Mr. Boone, do you wish to speak in your defense?" Before Noah could rise, Abigail found herself standing. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Your Honor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "may I address the court?" Surprise flickered across the judge's face, but he nodded. "You may speak, Miss Mrs. Fletcher, Your Honor. I was present when Mr. White Elk examined the county records." Her voice grew stronger as she focused on the truth she needed to share. "The original filing shows Mr. Boone as the rightful owner. I saw it with my own eyes." The foreman's face darkened. "You expect us to take the word of a desperate spinster? A woman so eager for a man she'd attach herself to the first one who showed her pity." But Abigail stood her ground. "I can tell you exactly what we found, Your Honor. The original deed was filed on October 12th, 1873, recorded in Book 7 of Land Claims. Page 143. Mr. Boone's signature appears alongside witness marks from both the county clerk and the territorial surveyor. A murmur of interest rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward. "You seem quite certain of these details, Mrs. Fletcher." "I am, Your Honor. I also noticed that the railroad's deed shows signs of alteration. The date appears to have been changed, and the paper is newer than it should be for a document supposedly filed 5 years ago." The foreman's face had grown red with anger. "This is outrageous," he snarled. "You take the word of this, This witness. The judge cut in sharply, who appears to have an excellent memory for detail. He studied the railroad's deed more closely. I do see what appears to be inconsistencies in the document. Noah reached for Abigail's hand, gripping it tightly. Pride shone in his eyes as he looked at her, and she felt strength flow through their joined fingers. The foreman wasn't finished. She's lying to protect him. Everyone knows she showed up uninvited, that he took her in from pity. What kind of witness would that make her? The kind who speaks truth? Henry White Elk's calm voice carried from his seat. I was there. She speaks correctly about the records. The judge tapped his gavel thoughtfully. Given the serious nature of these allegations and the evidence presented, I cannot make an immediate ruling. He fixed the foreman with a stern gaze. I will require the original county records to be brought before this court. Additionally, I want an expert to examine both deeds for authenticity. He raised his voice to be heard over the growing murmurs. This hearing is postponed until 1 week from today, when we will reconvene with the requested evidence. Court dismissed. The tension that had held Abigail upright suddenly drained away. Her knees weakened and she swayed slightly. Noah's arm was there instantly, supporting her. Easy now, he whispered. I've got you. They made their way slowly through the dispersing crowd. Some people still stared, but the looks were different now, thoughtful rather than mocking. The foreman stormed past them, his face dark with fury. Outside, the winter sun had climbed high, making the snow blindingly bright. Abigail's legs still felt wobbly as Noah helped her toward their wagon. Thank you, he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. What you did in there, standing up like that. Abigail managed a shaky smile. I only spoke the truth. You spoke it bravely. His hand covered hers where it rested on the wagon seat. I've never been prouder of anyone in my life. The ride home was quiet, both of them processing the morning's events. The frozen landscape sparkled around them, beautiful and harsh, like truth itself. Abigail's heart gradually steadied as the familiar shape of their cabin came into view. Their cabin, she thought, and for the first time. She truly believed it might remain so. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in gold when Henry White Elk's horse appeared on the ridge. Abigail spotted him first through the cabin window, where she'd been watching anxiously since sunrise. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her skirts. Noah. He's here. She called, her voice tight with anticipation. Noah emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers. They watched together as Henry guided his mount down the slope, his saddlebags bulging with promise. I have them, Henry announced as he dismounted, producing a leather folder. Official copies from the territorial office, sealed and certified. His usually stoic expression held a hint of satisfaction. Abigail's heart leaped. Thank the Lord, she whispered. Noah quickly hitched the wagon while Abigail gathered supplies for the journey. The morning air was crisp, hinting at another storm brewing in the peaks. Slush from yesterday's partial thaw made the trail treacherous. But Noah handled the reins with careful precision. Henry rode alongside them, occasionally pointing out fresh tracks in the mud. Railroad men been watching the trail, he noted. But they won't try anything in broad daylight. The wagon wheels splashed through puddles of half-frozen muck, sending sprays of dirty water across the wooden sides. Abigail held tight to the seat, determined not to show her nervousness. Noah glanced at her occasionally, his face tight with concern. You all right? He asked softly after a particularly rough patch. She nodded, managing a small smile. I'm holding steady. The courthouse loomed before them as they entered town, its shadow stretching across the muddy street. More people filled the square than yesterday, word having spread about the pending decision. Abigail felt their stares as Noah helped her down from the wagon. but she kept her chin high. Inside, the benches creaked under the weight of the crowd. The railroad foreman stood near the front, his face dark with barely contained rage. Henry moved quietly to the witness stand when called, his testimony clear and measured as he explained the evidence of forgery. The original document shows clear signs of tampering, Henry stated, pointing to specific marks on the railroad's deed. Here and here, where dates were altered. The paper itself is wrong for the claimed time period. The judge examined the documents carefully, comparing them to the certified copies Henry had brought. His expression grew increasingly stern as the evidence mounted. When he finally spoke, his voice carried authority that silenced even the whispers. Having examined all evidence presented, this court finds the railroad's claim to be fraudulent. He fixed the foreman with a hard stare. Mr. Boone's ownership is hereby confirmed as valid and binding. Furthermore, I warn the railroad against any future attempts at such deception. This territory may be young, but we are not lawless. The courtroom erupted. Several ranchers whooped and clapped, while others, those with railroad interests, glowered silently. The foreman's face turned purple with fury. He knocked over his chair as he stormed toward the door. Shoving past onlookers, relief flooded through Abigail so strongly that her vision swam. The room tilted sideways, but before she could fall, Noah's strong arms caught her. "Easy now," he murmured, supporting her weight. "I've got you." Outside, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Henry approached them, his dark eyes serious despite their victory. "This isn't over," he said quietly, clasping Noah's shoulder. "Railroad men don't give up easy. I'll keep watch on the trails, warn you if I see trouble coming." Noah nodded gratefully. "Much obliged, friend." The ride home was silent but charged with unspoken emotions. The wagon swayed gently through the gathering dusk, stars beginning to pepper the darkening sky. Abigail felt drained, yet oddly peaceful, as if a great weight had lifted from her shoulders. Back at the cabin, Noe built up the fire while Abigail prepared a simple supper. Neither seemed able to find words for what had transpired. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as they sat in their usual places, Noah in his chair, Abigail on her stool near the hearth. Noah watched her as she mended one of his shirts by firelight, her needle flashing steadily despite the day's excitement. Something had changed in how he saw her. This wasn't just the woman he'd rescued from mockery months ago. This was someone who had stood beside him, fought for him, believed in truth as fiercely as he did. He realized, with sudden clarity, that she wasn't merely a guest in his home anymore. Somehow, without his noticing, she had become essential to him. She was the partner he had prayed for during all those lonely years. Though he'd never imagined God would answer quite this way, the fire crackled softly as night settled around their cabin, their shared victory making the silence sweet rather than heavy. The March winds swept away winter's chill, revealing patches of muddy earth beneath melting snow. Inside the cabin, Abigail hummed Amazing Grace while piecing together squares of fabric for a new quilt. Her fingers moved steadily, each stitch placed with care and purpose. Through the window, she could see Noah mending the north fence, his broad shoulders bent to the task. He paused occasionally to watch her tend to the chickens, a smile tugging at his weathered face. That evening, as they shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Noah cleared his throat. "Used to reckon I'd live out my days alone," he said softly. "Now I see the Lord had other plans, given me a second chance at life." Abigail's eyes grew misty, her cheeks flushing pink in the lamplight. Later, they sat before the fire while she read from Psalms, their hands resting close on the worn Bible. Noah's calloused fingers found hers, entwining them gently. "You're no burden, Abigail," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "You're my blessing." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you." They parted for bed, hearts pounding with unspoken joy and the promise of tomorrow. 3 days after Noah spoke his heart, he visited Pastor Matthews privately in the small church office. The morning sun streamed through dusty windows as they arranged for a simple ceremony. Noah's hands twisted his hat nervously, but his voice rang clear with certainty. Back at the cabin, Abigail's fingers moved steadily over white muslin, creating a modest dress from fabric she'd saved. Every stitch carried a prayer of gratitude. When Henry arrived with an armful of purple and yellow wildflowers gathered from the mountainside, her eyes welled with tears at his thoughtfulness. On the wedding morning, Abigail's hands trembled as she pinned her hair. Townsfolk filed into the church, their curious eyes following her every move. Whispers rustled like dry leaves through the pews. But when Noah took her hand before the altar, his voice rang out strong and clear. "I asked God for a partner in this fight, and He sent me Abigail," as they spoke their vows. Tears glistened in Abigail's eyes. The congregation bowed their heads reverently, touched by the simple sincerity of their words. Afterward, everyone gathered to share fresh bread and coffee in fellowship. Even those who had once mocked now offered handshakes and hesitant smiles, though a few faces still wore scowls of disapproval. That evening, Noah carried Abigail across the threshold of their cabin, joy ringing in his laughter. They shared a quiet supper together, marveling at God's mercy in bringing two lonely hearts. To find such unexpected happiness, spring painted the valley in vibrant hues. Purple wildflowers dotted the grass as Abigail knelt in her small garden, carefully tending the tender shoots. Through the cabin window, lamplight cast a warm glow against the deepening dusk. Inside, she hummed softly while stirring a pot of fragrant stew. Her movements sure and peaceful. Noah's boots scraped the porch as he returned from checking fence lines. His tired expression softened at the sight of Abigail, his wife, making their house a home. The door creaked open as Henry arrived. His smile broad with good news. The railroad had finally withdrawn its claim entirely. They gathered around the rough-hewn table, sharing bowls of steaming stew and stories of triumph. After Henry bid them farewell, Noah drew Abigail close by the crackling fire. He lifted her hand to his lips, whispering tenderly, "Home's never been home until you." Abigail leaned against his shoulder, joyful tears brightening her eyes. Outside, stars blazed over the mountain peaks, while inside their cabin, a new family rested secure in faith, love, and dignity. The once mocked bride had become cherished wife, her voice lifting in hymns that echoed through Colorado's valleys. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.